Welcome. Thank you all for being here this evening. I know it's rather rainy and cold, but we are so glad that, let's see, can I use this? That you all have resolved to be here this evening. I know, really cheesy. So I'm happy that you all are here in both realms of life. So today we are continuing on the chapter in this book, in chapter 11 of Jesus in Our Days. We always go over the meaning behind each particular topic that Joanna chooses to discuss, which in chapter 11 is the word resolve. How appropriate, because we just passed the new year and people are making a lot of resolutions and resolving to change their behaviors, hopefully. And we had discussed that previously at one of our recent talks as well. So we already know what it means to be resolved to do something or to resolve. It means to decide firmly on a course of action or a firm determination to do something. When you decide to do something and follow a certain course of action, or to decide to get healthy, or to decide to make peace within yourself, you're resolving to do something. So that resolve is kind of going to be the backbone of what we talk about today. We're going to discuss a little bit about Christ, about Jesus, and his one of the quotes from the Bible, an encounter with Jesus, and how that is a direct reflection of how we should be living our current life and reflecting in our current life. Because ultimately, as we go through this particular excerpt from the Bible, from Luke 9, verses 57 through 62, it's also in Matthew, and this is the cost of following Jesus. I'm going to read to you the verses from the Bible, and then we're going to discuss a little bit about what Joanna says about it and how that applies to us. As they were going along the road, someone said to him, Jesus, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus said to him, foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. To another he said, follow me. But he said, Lord, let me first go and bury my father. And Jesus said to him, leave the dead to bury their own dead. But as for you, go and proclaim the kingdom of God. Now, at first glance, we might think, well, that's really strange. Isn't that kind of harsh for Jesus to say, oh, go let the dead bury the dead, come and follow me instead? I didn't mean to rhyme there. It seems almost a little bit harsh, right? Does anyone get that? Like, it's like, oh gosh, like, let the dead go bury their dead. Cold, right? Because you think, for those of you who have ever lost anyone, it's important for us to be there, to mourn, to be in the process. But in order for us to understand the biblical text from Luke, we have to understand the context from where it came from. So the context in the time of Jesus, when the Jews lived at that time, it's important for us to understand what the burial process was at that time, okay? So at that time, the burial process was like this. So somebody would die, and they would be put into a special, be wrapped up in a special cloth, thank you, and be put into a secluded area, like a cave. Usually it was carved by stone. And they would stay there, and it would be covered by a larger stone. And for about a year, they would wait for the body to decompose. There were no, at that time, in that part of the world, there were no preservatives yet. So they had to wait for the body to decay. After about close to a year, the family used to come back and gather the bones of the deceased and put it into one of these sort of family boxes, if you will, and store it inside of sort of another cave area where other families' bones are all placed together in this same little boxes. Well, they're large boxes, actually, made of stone. So this was the common practice at that time. Was that? No, for everybody. Yep, for everybody. And there actually were people, if your family for some reason wasn't able to fully, if it was too emotional, you could have specialized people or relatives or friends who actually would help in wrapping the body and putting the body away, and even going back to gather the bones. Didn't necessarily, at least according to the custom, it didn't have to be a family member who went back to get the bones of the deceased. This is important because when we talk about the text from Luke, many scholars, and even Joanna, and we'll get into that in a second here, debate whether or not the man who was telling Jesus, well, I have to go and bury my father, at what point in the burial process was he? Because it's highly likely that this particular man's father had already been through the first process, because they bury their dead at that time very quickly, because the decomposition sets in quickly. So within the first 24 hours, generally at that time, they would be put in a shroud and put into the cave. So it's highly likely that at that time that man was talking to Jesus, that his father was already in the cave, which means he had a year before he even needed to go back to gather the bones. And even still, when Jesus says, leave the dead to bury their dead, he was highly likely inferring the fact that a family member didn't have to be the one to go and A, bury the body, and B, be the one to pick up the body or pick up the bones a year or so later. So this was could have been an excuse, and Joanna kind of goes through different possibilities in understanding this text. And she says, it's possible that the son maybe really wanted to, just wanted to bury the father, or he was hiding some other intention. It's either or. There's no in between. It's possible the son did just want to be there, or there's something else going on. So she goes on to some theories. She says, perhaps he wanted to be seen as a faithful, loving son, or wanted to appear as deserving of his possible inheritance. Perhaps the young man wanted to enjoy his youth and was unwilling to renounce it, using his excuse as a seemingly worthy way to avoid commitment. And Joanna interjects here and reminds us that material pleasures are powerful chains that bind people to primitive passions they must overcome for their own benefit, but which nearly always lead to moral decay and the death of ideals. I'm going to read that again. Material pleasures, which is what perhaps this particular man who Jesus asked to follow him, he declined. It's possible that he didn't want to let go of his riches. And Joanna interjects here saying, material pleasures are powerful chains. We all can imagine what a chain is, that bind people to primitive passions they must overcome for their own benefit, which nearly always leads to moral decay and the death of ideals. She goes on to say that another possibility is perhaps the fear of new responsibilities, caused the candidate unreasonable fear, which in turn led to his excuse. So it's a possibility maybe he just was afraid to make a commitment. And Joanna kind of explains it a little bit more. She says, the fear of taking on serious commitments, think about what that means, prevents individuals from developing morally and intellectually, and keeps them stuck in the unconcerned, monotonous routines of their daily lives. Jesus' invitation comes with an intense action plan that starts with inner renewal and continues in constructive activity for the good everywhere. And then she reminds us that fear, the emotion of fear, is a dissolving factor of human individuality. It is responsible for avoidable tragedies and crimes. It is a driving force behind the death of dignifying achievements and of individuals themselves. We highlighted a part in this text where Joanna refers to the action plan that Jesus sets out when he makes his invitation, really to all of us. It's this inner renewal. And how perfect when Leah was reading this particular message from Happy Life, page 215, about kind of similar thing. Am I on the right page? Yes. A personal achievement. The conquest of knowledge is a personal achievement, non-transferable. So this inner renewal, we cannot transfer that responsibility to anybody. We cannot say, well, I'm going to let my sibling, my loved one, my partner, or some other person do it. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to, just give that responsibility to somebody else in my life. But that's impossible because it's non-transferable. Nobody can grow for you. No one can shine a light inside of your soul for you. Someone can share their light. Does that make sense? But they can't give you the same light, and just all of a sudden you're going to acquire through osmosis. So these are some of the possibilities, and she goes on for another possibility. She says perhaps this particular man who declined Jesus' offer, perhaps he was generally concerned about his discarnate father. However, again, fact is, any person could have buried the corpse. But no one except the young man himself could be responsible for his own illumination. The young man left to bury his father and never returned. He missed his chance. Many still do. And this is a small and meek sentence, it appears, at this end of this particular paragraph that Joanna writes. But it's so powerful because she reminds us that we are much like that man who wanted to follow Jesus, but he said, wow, I have some other things to take care of first. And Jesus was reminding him, because Jesus already knew, and Joanna tells us in this chapter that Jesus knew his true intentions, knew exactly. Joanna doesn't specifically tell us, she gives us possibilities, but she said Jesus knew what his true intentions were and told him, let the dead bury the dead. You don't have to go and do that. You can still follow me. It's not like, because some people believe, well, that's a contradiction to his saying of honor thy father and thy mother. No, it's not a contradiction. Because again, you have to understand the context of which it was said and the cultural norms and social norms at that time. So, like Joanna reminds us, anyone could have buried the corpse. But no one could do the inner growth and the work and inner renewal that man needed to do, and that we all are called to do. No one else can do it for us. Joanna goes on to say a few words of wisdom, words that she wants us to reflect about in our own personal lives. One, she says, watch what you have chosen in your current existence. Living to pursue the authentic existential objectives or accumulating lifeless treasures only to bury them in the dust of oblivion. In layman's terms, what are we doing with our lives? What are our goals in our lives? What are we aiming towards in our lives? What are we working towards in our lives? Are we working hard to accumulate material possessions, or are we working hard to acquire inner treasures? Joanna, and I'll mention this, I believe, a little bit later, she mentions that there's nothing wrong with money per se. Money can bring lots of comfort, but it is not the end-all to be-all. You can't take it with you when you go. So it's something that we need to be, and we've discussed this before about evaluating our lives, where we're at in the process, setting goals for ourselves, making sure we're doing that either daily, weekly, monthly, hopefully not yearly, but frequently reevaluating your own personal purpose in life. It's really important that we ask ourselves that question. So let's take a quick minute let's stop. And I want you to, this is a rhetorical question, you're not going to answer me, but answer to yourself, what are you living for? What are you working towards in your life? Where is most of your time spent? Achieving what? Is it to, as Joanna puts it, pursuing this authentic self, connecting with higher powers, goodness, love, spirituality, or is it all about accumulating lifeless treasures, as she calls it, material things that we cannot take with us? Because she reminds us they get buried in the dust of oblivion. Somewhere in one of her books, Joanna makes reference to when a lot of people say, well, I don't know where to begin. And recently in talking with a friend of mine and discussing this similar topic, she said to me, well, I don't know where I need to begin. Where should I begin? Like, I know that I want to work on myself. I know that I want to be a better person, but like, where do I begin? Like, I don't even know. There's so much stuff like inside of myself. And Joanna, her advice is begin wherever you are. Begin with something very simple. Maybe it's working on a particular thing that's bothering you. For instance, it's much like Ben Franklin's 13 virtues. He chose those 13 virtues and to work towards each one. So let's say you want to work on being a better listener. So you can record yourself. I don't mean literally record yourself, but like in a journal at the end of the day or a book to see how you did in listening to others during the day. Just to do an evaluation. But how else? What other things do you guys do or believe you can do to engage in soul searching? How do you soul search? How does one go about soul searching? Because it's so abstract. It's not tangible. I can't hold it in my hand and say, this is my soul, and I'm searching for it, or I'm going inside of it. It's abstract. So it's much more difficult, perhaps, to explain. But what are ways that you feel like you get to know yourself? You are trying to know who you are. What are ways to do this soul searching? Yeah, oh, absolutely.
I was a little bit going through that book of Leon Denis, The Problem of the Being, of the Destiny and the Pain. And I think in the third part or second part, whatever, there is the potentials of the soul. So we all have these potentials that may be more or less dormant. Some are awakening, but some are still very dormant. That's why we are really stuck to the material, to ego aspect of our existence. So the soul searching, I imagine that it could be for me to search for these potentials that may be hidden. And one of the potentials that is the potential of the soul is the will. So in any entrepreneurial activity, whatever, you decide to do diet or engage in some resolution, you need to have the will. And the interesting thing, the will, they say, is an attribute of the soul, but it may be just in potential level. It is not completely awakened. We have this potential. So I think a soul searching should be to search for all these potentials that we have.
I love it, Yasko. You can leave. You can turn it off and leave it right there. Thank you. Anyone else have any other suggestions or ways that they've done any soul searching or just working on themselves? I guess everybody's just really shy, or... You agree with Yasko? Yasko said it all. Isn't that the answer we give to the teacher when she's asking for suggestions? Yeah. I think it was a great addition to Joanna's words, this particular book that you're referring to, which is not yet in English, I don't believe. But that we all do indeed have these potentials. So we are always thinking about what are the practical ways to approach soul searching. So what's one practical way I can soul search? Can someone just get back? It's off, so you need to turn on.
I agree with you, Oscar. No, no, I think this goes with what she was saying too. It's interesting what Joanna de Angelis does, and in which is she raised possibilities. She doesn't judge, but she raised possibility of what could have happened. As you mentioned, Jesus knew what was happening, his intention, his true intentions, based on his capabilities to read the mind, the soul in general. But what she does, I think, is in itself, the chapter in itself lays ahead a good practical way for us to deal with our issues. And you can ask yourself, okay, why do I go through this? Could it be an excuse? Could it be that, in fact, I'm suffering? And you go over those possibilities, not letting yourself get caught up on the possibilities and not move on, but to alert you and say, this is it, or this may be it, because sometimes we don't have the true answer to that problem. But then you look for an alternative or something different, because obviously if you're caught up on a situation, you're not going to go anywhere if you maintain the same behavior. So I think that's a good way for us to ask ourselves, okay, so maybe why do I go through this? Why do I see this way? You look at the other side, you look at yourself, and with that, I believe that is a practical way that we can move on into a new capability of follow Jesus. And to follow Jesus doesn't have to be that we truly going to follow Jesus, but move on into new resolutions.
Absolutely. Thank you for that addition, Leo. Appreciate that. Definitely. It reminds us of something someone said about checking in with yourself. Checking in with yourself. How are you doing? How are you feeling? Where are you at? And reflecting on your life, as Leo was mentioning. Why am I enduring what I'm enduring? Why am I experiencing what I'm experiencing? If I may interject, one way to add to what Yasko and Leo were talking about, one way to soul search, if you don't know where to start, there's a great book by Joanna de Angelis entitled Existential Conflicts. It's a fantastic book. She talks about many different emotions, anxiety, fear, death, love, and a whole slew of other emotions and conflicts. Laziness, anger, fear, resentment, guilt, jealousy, anxiety, cruelty, violence, etc., drug addiction, tobacco issues. It's a great place to start if you're curious about, perhaps you have some issues with guilt or anxiety, or you had some issues surrounding death, loss of a loved one. This is a great place where you can start. She gives fantastic insight from a psychological perspective if you're unsure where to begin. And contrary to popular belief, her work is not difficult to understand. It just forces us to study a little bit more and to read more and put more effort into our library of studies. So first, Joanna wants us to reflect what we are living for. And second step, engage in actual soul searching. Open yourself up on the inside, meaning let's take the practical steps. Let's not just talk about it because it sounds fantastic. It sounds great to hear about it and to hear people say that they're doing it, or just hear about it in general, or to read about it. But we have one of the most important words in her sentence here is engage. What does to engage mean? To actually be a part of it. Yeah. to actually be a part. That's kind of what you guys are saying as well. But to put yourself in it and actually make it part of your repertoire, make it part of your life. So I can set a goal and say, well, I would like to be X and Y. I would like to be a better person, and I would like to eat healthier, and I would like to be more patient. Fantastic. Those are great goals to have. So how are you engaging in them? What are the steps? Because the difference between a dream and a goal are steps and the ways in which we are going to achieve those things. It's great to dream. It's fantastic. But we must engage. Ooh, sorry about that. And then she goes on to say, what do you have that death cannot confiscate? What do you have that is real that can follow you? So I actually wanted to open up the floor for this. What do you have that death cannot confiscate? So think about that for a second. Education, experience, love, fears, anxieties. True, true. Very true. Anybody else? Successes. What do you have that is real that can follow you? The good you do, good deeds, or the lack thereof, knowledge, feelings. Cheerfulness, all those things. Anything that's pretty much non-material, yeah. We can take with us in our soul. We keep with us. So it's important that we know that, yes, we're engaging in soul searching, but how much good content are we collecting in our soul? Again, it's great to have a dream. It's even better when we have steps to achieve our goals and dreams. And what percentage of what we're doing are things that we can take with us when we go? It's an important question because sometimes we get hung up, not that there's anything wrong with wanting to make good money. There's a purpose for money in our lives and have nice things. There's a purpose for that. However, we have to have a good balance of everything in life. So what percentage of what we're doing can we take with us when we go on to the next life? Something for us to think about. She says, be severe with this examination of your conscience and put yourself in the young man's shoes. Be severe with this examination of your conscience. What does it mean to be severe with our conscience? Definitely. To be dead set on looking at yourself honestly. But also putting yourself in the shoes of the young man. What would you have done, do you think? If you were living at that time, or even now, Jesus is calling us to follow him. And these are some of the ways we can follow his love, his message, working on ourselves, engaging in soul searching, working on things that the physical realm cannot kill or cannot expire. Anyone else? Yasko.
Considering that introduction that you gave was wonderful about the process of burying the dead, so it's a very long process. So I imagine that was common for one not to be available at the moment of some of the steps, has to be taken care. So it probably was part of the culture. So there was no big deal for him if he wanted actually to follow Jesus, to follow and let other people that were there to take care. I know at that time to follow Jesus, that doesn't mean it's 1 week. No, it's for years. You go and only 1-2 years later you're gonna come back. So it's for all the many situations there. If you want to travel, you won't be at home soon. So I think it was clear for everyone when he said, let the ones that is there to bury them, because they are already there. And you that want to enlighten yourself, that's feeling the urge to follow me, why not? So I think I would follow, that would be the option, because was within the cultural set.
Exactly. It means that the possibility was definitively there for this young man to make that choice. But he chose otherwise. And the question that Joanna actually leaves us with in this particular paragraph, she ends it by saying, how would you have responded to Jesus? Would we have been like the man and not wanting to let go of our riches or our potential inheritance and living that lavish life? In what ways are we now still negating Christ's request to follow him? When we put material things above all other things, and sometimes we don't intentionally do that. We don't say, oh, I don't believe, although I'm not so experienced in life and although I've lived past lives, I haven't lived so long in this life. I've never encountered anyone that's ever said, I want to be materialistic. I lavish in being materialistic and self-centered. Nobody says those things. I don't believe. However, sometimes we unintentionally live that way, where my most prized possessions are physical things. So it's something for us to think about, because Jesus is still calling us today. And that's what Joanna is reminding us in her text. And some last words she leaves for us to ponder that we're going to discuss. She says, you complain and keep tabs on the problems afflicting you, ignoring or trying to ignore the fact that you are on the earth to learn, atone, and re-educate yourself. Did anybody complain today about anything? To yourself in your mind or to somebody else? It could be anything. It could be complaining of the weather, because we were probably all complaining of the weather today. It's icy, it's cold, it's wet. Nobody complained today? No judgment, it's just a question. Wow. Oh, go ahead.
I don't know if, it's the right answer. But I complain to myself most of the times that I'm not strong enough to follow the thing I think is right to do. And I say, oh my God, I didn't do that. I should read, study more. And I'm complaining to myself that why I cannot do it? Why I'm still stuck here, and why I have fear. And sometimes I have fears, and oh my God, why do I have these fears? Why? Then I'm complaining to myself always. I do complain to myself. No, I don't complain about the weather, the things I complain what the things I don't do to myself that I know is good for me, and I don't do it. I don't do it. This is my complaining always.
So you're able to acknowledge, as Joanna calls it, what's afflicting you. You're able to say, this is what is bothering me, this is my shortcoming, why am I still stuck? And what her response to that is that to start an internal dialogue with yourself, reminding yourself that we're on this earth to learn, and that it's okay that you might be conflicted. It's okay. It's a part of the process. It's okay to be in this process where you're still educating and re-educating yourself. And Joanna talks a lot a lot, and we brought this up recently again, about having self-compassion. As you're saying what you're saying to me and to us, I'm sure all of us want to come and give you a hug and say, Jeanette, you're such a good person. Keep going. You're doing a great job. But when we are talking to ourselves, we don't often talk to ourselves like, it's okay. You're strong. You're a good person. No, we're often severe with ourselves in a negative respect. Now, Joanna does tell us to be severe with our examination, but not be mean to ourselves. To be severe in our examination, it does not mean to be mean and horrible to yourself and to degrade yourself and to say, gosh, look at where I'm at. I'm still stuck. I'm there. But we all do that. Because if your bestie comes to you and is like, oh, I'm going through this, and you're more than likely to say, no, girl, you're good. You're strong. You got this. But how often do we say that to ourselves? Does anyone have that internal dialogue with themselves? Which dialogue? Yeah, the negative one, yeah. It is a terrible internal dialogue. But it's good that if you can recognize that you have it, because many people have that internal dialogue and do not recognize that they have it. So the first step is to be able to recognize that there is an issue. And to begin a new... So do we all know what internal dialogue means? What does it mean to have an internal dialogue? Talking to yourself. You ever walk by a mirror and cringe and say something to yourself, or look at bathing suits? Maybe this is a woman thing. Or look at something or other people and tell yourself a story. You create this whole internal dialogue that's negative. Most of us do it. Can be positive, should be positive. We should work towards that. But oftentimes we're much more likely to have a negative internal dialogue that we need to be aware of and work on. It's something that we can actually be teaching our children and our teens and asking them, what are the kinds of things and thoughts that they have about themselves when they look in the mirror? Important for us to think about that. She goes on to say, look around and you will see how urgent your decision is for what is best and long-lasting as an immortal being. Look around and you will see how urgent your decision is for what is best and long-lasting as an immortal being. So we can gauge in our life how important our decisions are by looking at the world around us. I recently was watching this clip of this homosexual man, and he was talking about his experience in being a homosexual, and he had tragically lost someone very close to him, and it really threw him into a depression for a little bit. And when he was interviewed about it, he said that the impact of the death of this dear person in his life put things into perspective for him about how important and urgent it was for him to decide to live his life more authentically. So from then moving forward, he decided to transition from being male to female. Now, the point of the story is not the story itself, but the fact that the principle behind it, that if we reflect enough on what's going on in the world around us, we'll know how important it is to make certain decisions that are long-lasting for us, to live authentically. For those of you who are Brazilian or who speak Portuguese, or who live in Brazil, or who have lived in Brazil, or have access to Brazilian TV, music and such like that, there's this famous DJ called DJ Alok, And he has an interesting story that happened to him in probably the last 5 years, I want to say, because he recently became much more engaged in philanthropic and volunteerism. So he told the story. I heard him tell the story of what happened, what brought him to that realization in his life. He was at the height of his career, making a lot of money, cars, just everything you can imagine, private jets from here and there, and just money flowing out of his ears. And he said one particular day, he was on an airplane, and the airplane began to have a lot of turbulence. And the turbulence turned into, they almost crashed. And he said from that moment on, as he was almost going to die, he reflected on his life, what he's doing with his life, his purpose, his meaning, why God has allowed him to gain such success coming from so little in Brazil. So he said from that day forward, his perspective, his drive changed. The reason he wanted to do things in his life changed. So for a lot of us, it takes those extreme situations, but we don't have to reach those extreme situations to make a reevaluation of our lives. Joanna goes on to say, if you put off making a decision, then when you finally do make it, the circumstances will not be the same and your situation will be different, perhaps complicated. In the book, I want to say Paul and Stephen. That's one where Abigail's in it, right? Yeah. Right? Because Abigail was, involved. Yeah. Okay. So I think it's in that particular book that I'm thinking of, or it could be 2,000 years ago, because it's when the books all kind of blur together after a while. But in one of those books, either in 2,000 years ago or in Paul and Stephen, there's the story of the man who encounters Jesus. I want to say it's 2,000 years ago, where he encounters Jesus, and at the time it's Publius Lentulus, where he encounters Jesus, and at that time his wife was able to be cognizant of the importance of the message that Jesus was bringing, and was able to change and begin to follow him. But her husband, Publius Lentulus, was not ready, or he didn't deem himself ready, or he just didn't make that decision then and there. He could have, with his wife, changed his life, followed Christ, and his history and story would have been very different from the one it ended up as. Instead, by the time he reached the point where he was ready to follow Christ, he was in a much worse condition than when he was the first time Christ had called him. And you can read more about it in the book to understand the context of it all. But that story is very much true, and Joanna's affirming that if we are receiving the call in which we all are called, let us begin to make those small changes in our lives. Because she says the time is now. She goes on to say, let yourself be permeated with his presence and follow him joyfully. We go back to the practicality of things. How can we practically allow ourselves to be permeated with his presence and follow him joyfully, especially when we all have our own internal conflicts and issues? How does one do that? How does one accomplish that? Anyone have any suggestions or ideas, personal beliefs, things that they've done? There's no wrong answer. How do we allow ourselves to be open to receive the presence of higher spirituality of Christ and be able to follow him with a happy heart? What's that, Yasko? Grab the mic for me.
Yeah, it is among us that we are the whole time, listening, studying about Jesus' life, his teachings, etc., the impact what he had. in their lives that time, and now we revisiting. It's what we are being, in any moment where we see somebody that is needing our help, you feel that joy of helping. You're not doing, can I get this out of IRS? No, you're not thinking about that. So from the heart, joyfully, we like to help. We really are driven to help. I think, I don't know if we ask for someone that is more materialistic, that is not in this everyday listening or reading something about, his teaching. I don't know how they would answer. Oh, yes, only when I go at night, because it is the way I was taught to before I sleep, to pray, something like that, something that is sad. I don't know. Or in the morning, But it's more in the action that we feel that he is permeating us. It's almost like the magnet is kind of on us,
Right. Thank you, Jaska, for sharing that. Yeah, definitely. Sometimes it is that we have to actually reflect on what makes us feel that way. So whether it's reading about Jesus, whether it's doing a meditation with Jesus, which we have some CDs here, whether it's studying about his life or just about spirituality in general, things that bring us closer to the ideals of spirituality, kindness towards others, because not everyone, and you don't have to be a spiritist or even a Christian to follow Christ, because there are many people that may not even consciously know of Christ, but act very Christ-like. We have examples in humanity, within societies, people who appear to be permeated with his presence, that just have this air of lightness about them, and love and gentleness and kindness. So it is a process. It actually takes us doing things and reflecting to be able to reach this feeling of permeation with his presence. So it warrants us to ask ourselves the question, how am I making myself more permeable to his presence? We are all permeable to different energies, whether it's negative or positive in our lives. So how are we making ourselves more permeable for the positive, for the uplifting, to allow joy in our hearts? Go ahead, Jaska.
Well, I can see when I am impermeable, blocked. And I see many people also that even the life is striking hardly, they can't get it. So there's impermeable to any influence, to any good talk or good words, So I can understand from the negative part. It's easy for me to understand. And there are times that we are so upset, we're so on our own problem, real concrete problem, that it can, be all around the help, and we impermeable, because we have this mindset to that problem, the way we think should be.
Definitely. So along the lines of what you're saying, Jaska, reminds me of that story that Divaldo tells of, I think he was in a different country, and he's sitting at a table, I think he's at some sort of restaurant or location, maybe even a house, having dinner, and there are people coming in to serve and bring in food and whatnot, and Joanna appears to Divaldo in the midst of this dinner and points out to this young gentleman and says, "Go over there and give him a hug." And he's like, dialoguing with her in his mind, going, "What are you talking about? That's crazy. I'm not going to get up, randomly hug someone." And Divaldo even reflects, he said, "I'm not the kind of person to be overly hugging people." It's not his, right, a waiter. It's not his personal disposition necessarily. So when he said, even so, he doesn't know who this man is. What if this man reacts in a bad way? So he goes on for a little bit of this dialogue with Joanna, and she keeps insisting, go up to this man and give him a hug. So after some time, he finally approaches this waiter and gives him a hug. Now, my memory is not serving me correctly, but the overall gist of the story is that particular man was planning on killing himself because he had an end-stage cancer, and he felt that he would be a burden on his family if he stayed alive because the cost of treatment was very expensive, and he would not be able to afford it. And he had children, and he had a wife, and he felt, well, if I kill myself, my family does not have to incur the debt, the burden of treating me. So he had resolved already to kill himself that night. So when Divaldo came up to him and gave him a hug, something switched in him. And if anyone else knows the story, can interject at any time. But it was in that moment that I think is most meaningful and important, because something what Yasko was saying, because sometimes we're so stuck in our own fixation of negativity or stuck in our own problems that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to see out or to be permeable. That's why the Jesus and the good spirits use people around us that are permeable at that time to help one another. So obviously, Divaldo being who he is, being such an ascensive medium, he was obviously permeable to Joanna. But how many times are we in a crowd of a lot of people? I don't know if anyone has ever experienced this, but you had the sudden urge to walk up to someone and say something nice to them. It's happened to me many times. And I never hold back from doing that, even when it's very odd. Generally, it's to other women, not to men, but for obvious reasons. But generally it is. And just going up and saying something nice. Your smile is so contagious, because we don't know the sufferings of people. We don't know, because it's very easy. Many people can be what they call high-functioning depressive people and live what looks like seemingly perfect lives, but deep down, they're stuck in darkness. And your hug or your kindness is that catalyst that they need to change, to open up, to begin to open up a little bit. She goes on to finish by saying, with that attitude, your problems will look differently. They will lose their stressful significance and will actually contribute to your happiness. When we change our perspectives, because we can't always change our circumstances, but when we change how we look at something, we can see how beneficial it can actually be for our lives. As our dear friend Paula always says, the need to ask ourselves, where's the lesson in this, is very important. And Joanna ends this chapter by saying, you will be reborn from the ashes to soar towards the great light, overcoming the unnerving night. So this is the hope that she gives us, that we can be reborn out of our darkness into this great light, into this positivity. It's really important for us to do our best that we can in our lives to help self-compassion, first and foremost. But it's also important for us to show love and kindness towards others, even if we are having a bad day. Because we never know what someone else is going through. And in speaking with a professional colleague of mine who was explaining something to me, she was explaining how depression affects the brain and how it affects the mind, and how when people, not moments of depression and sadness, because everybody has that, moments of anxiety can be normal, but when it comes to the level of a disorder, she says, when we reach that level of the disorder, when you are extremely depressed or very anxious, it's almost impossible, if not impossible, to get out of that in that moment, because you feel helpless and you truly believe that in that moment, all is helpless. Unless we can build up a storage of tools, whether it's positive habits around us. And Joanna talks about in many of her books about yoga, meditation, coming to the Spiritist Center, receiving passes, studying, doing your own personal studying, reading, having these positive resources of support around us to see us through these moments of darkness. Something for us to think about, because she does give us this hope that there is out there, that much like this man here, there's a long road ahead of us, but there's a lot of goodness to come. So, last but not least, let us resolve to follow the Master and allow ourselves to be transformed into a new person, into a new you, a new me. Thank you all for listening. I really appreciate it. I would like to open up for any comments, reflections, questions, curiosities, or just comments. Something that you liked or thought was interesting or not. Don't everyone raise their hand at the same time. I can't attend to everybody at the same time. Leo.
Thank you. Amazing message, Kirsten. So thank you for bringing this to us today. One of the aspects that I was contemplating when you were talking about the ability to be permeable is to live in the present. I think that it truly helps, and it goes with what Yasko was saying, that sometimes we get stuck with an idea, with an attitude or whatnot, mainly because we're stuck either in the past with something that has happened, and you're so entangled with the situation, the person, whatever that may be, or with yourself, with something that we have done and we don't forgive ourselves. As well as something that an anxiety of something that may happen in the future, right? And we don't know how to deal with it, or the fear on how to deal with what's to come. So I think that, if we allow ourselves to analyze the situation, let go, and be in the present, I believe we will be able to be permeable enough to, again, connect with the higher minds, connect with someone who may come to you and say something that, as we call, God sent, and said, look, why don't you try this way? Why don't you try that way? And even the difficult individuals that come to us to push us to become a better person, that sometimes because we're so caught up with the past or any other issue, we don't tend to analyze in a positive way. We put ourselves in the pity position where, poor me, I don't have to deal with this. But sometimes those push comes to really, help you leap forward. So to me, the present moment is important. What has happened, I can't change. And what will happen, it will happen when it comes. So that's something that was coming through my mind as we were speaking about it.
Fantastic addition for this talk. Thank you, Leo. It's truly so important to be present, to disconnect from our cell phones, from social media, from the TV, even when we're in the presence of our friends, just being present with one another. And as we're talking here, being present, not thinking about other things. I think what Leo said is very impactful, and Joanna actually talks about that in Existential Conflicts in the chapter when she discusses anxiety. And she talks about the people who suffer from anxiety and the inability to be sometimes present, that we're stuck worrying about things from the past or things of the future. So it's something very interesting to reflect on, that it is a good practice to work on mindfulness, to be present on where we are right now. So thank you, Leo, for your comment. It's much appreciated.
I'm thinking about how to be permeable. And this is very important, especially, as you said, when you are in that deep stage of depression, disorder, anxiety or depressive disorder. You don't want to see anybody. You don't want to be put outside to face anything. But I think the way God and the High Spirit comes to help us is through people, like you said. So I think consciously, at least, even when we don't want to, consciously say, thinking about this, the way God operates, I have to open up. I have at least to be out with people that I know, not with the strangers, of course, but allow ourselves to be with the family member for the help to come. They're not alone in the cocoon, you know. So it's an effort, but I think we should do, because that is the way God answers our prayer or our family members' prayer for our help, to be permeable to this help, is to go and be with people.
Absolutely. And Joanna actually talks about in that particular chapter on anxiety where and I was listening to a message by Alberto Almeida today when he was discussing the process of seeking help, that we go from the less invasive to the more invasive, where if we're having some struggles in our lives, perhaps we need to change our behavior, get more involved with religious organizations or spirituality or exercise, yoga, eating healthy, or different kinds of things that we can utilize. It's not necessarily a spiritist practice, but is a positive practice that can lead us to wholeness and stability. So sometimes it's also important for us to go and seek out what Joanna calls as a specialist to help us to endure and reflect on ourselves, because it's not an easy task for us to sit and just reflect on ourselves, because we have a lot of emotional baggage, perhaps from this life, most assuredly from previous lives. We all got it. So,